This is Marcus Reed broadcasting on shortwave frequency KRS 47 emergency relay, somewhere in the western United States. If you are hearing my voice, it means at least part of the world still has electricity, and at least one radio receiver is still functioning. That already makes you luckier than most people on this planet right now. I used to be a network infrastructure engineer before all of this started. My job was maintaining routing architecture for a regional internet exchange point outside Denver. For nearly 15 years, my entire professional life revolved around keeping packets moving across fiber optic cables that stretched across oceans and continents. Data moving invisibly through glass. At the time, it felt permanent, like electricity, like gravity, something the modern world could never lose. Now I sit inside a converted weather station surrounded by analog radio equipment from the 1980s, speaking into a microphone connected to a transmitter older than I am. Because the internet is gone. Not slow, not broken, gone. It started on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2032. At first it looked like a routine outage. I remember waking up and noticing my phone wasn't syncing email. That by itself wasn't unusual. Services fail all the time. Servers crash. Cloud providers go down. Usually the problem fixes itself before anyone outside the industry notices. But when I opened my laptop and checked the network monitoring dashboards, every graph was flat. Traffic across our exchange point had dropped by nearly 70% overnight. That doesn't happen. Entire continents would have to go dark for numbers like that. At first we assumed it was a monitoring failure, a glitch in the metrics pipeline. Then the calls started. Other engineers from neighboring exchange points began posting messages in our emergency operations channel. Chicago seeing routing failures. New York reporting massive BGP instability. European backbone providers reporting unreachable networks. By 8:30 a.m., the global routing tables were exploding. If you don't work in networking, you probably don't know what BGP is. Border Gateway Protocol. It's the system that tells the internet how to reach every network on Earth. Every website, every cloud server, every bank, every hospital database, every social media platform. BGP is the map. Without it, the internet doesn't know where anything is. And that morning the map was dissolving. Routes were appearing and disappearing every few seconds. Entire autonomous systems were withdrawing their network announcements like someone was unplugging countries one at a time. At first we thought it was a cyber attack. A massive one. Maybe the largest ever attempted. Someone poisoning routing tables. But attacks don't behave like this. An attacker usually tries to redirect traffic. What we were seeing was something else. Traffic wasn't being redirected. It was disappearing. Packets were being sent into networks that simply stopped responding. Dead ends. By mid-morning, our routers were processing hundreds of thousands of route changes per minute. That kind of instability pushes equipment to its limits. Routers are built to move traffic, not constantly rebuild the entire map of the internet. Engineers across the world began manually filtering routes just to keep their systems from crashing. That helped for about 20 minutes. Then the next wave hit. Major cloud providers started vanishing. Amazon's network routes disappeared first. Then Microsoft. Then Google. Imagine waking up and realizing half of the internet just vanished in under 10 minutes. Websites weren't loading. APIs stopped responding. DNS lookups failed. Every dependency modern software relies on was collapsing simultaneously. We began tracing routes manually using diagnostic tools. Packet traces looked like ghost signals. Data leaving one network, traveling 2 or 3 hops, then hitting a router that simply stopped forwarding. Not rejecting, not responding, just silent, like entire data centers had powered off. Engineers started posting traceroute screenshots from every continent. The pattern was the same everywhere. Traffic was being rerouted through increasingly distant networks as the routing system tried to compensate. Asia traffic being routed through Europe. European traffic being routed through North America. North American traffic bouncing through South America before dying somewhere in the Atlantic. The system was trying to find any path that still worked. But every reroute increased congestion. And congestion was building faster than infrastructure could handle. Submarine cable landing stations started reporting overload conditions. Those cables carry nearly all international internet traffic. Hundreds of fiber strands packed with data moving at the speed of light across oceans. But they're not infinite. They're engineered for predicted traffic patterns, not for a planetary-scale routing collapse. As traffic rerouted unpredictably across continents, certain cables became saturated. When fiber systems saturate, packets begin dropping. Dropped packets trigger retransmissions. Retransmissions increase congestion. Congestion causes more packet loss. It's a feedback loop. Within hours, the entire global network began choking itself. Meanwhile, outside the engineering world, people were just starting to notice something strange. Streaming services stopped working. Social media timelines froze. Messaging apps failed to send messages. At first, people assumed it was their Wi-Fi, then their phone carriers, then their local internet providers. No one yet understood that the backbone of the entire digital civilization was tearing itself apart. Inside our network operations center, we watched as thousands of networks vanished from the routing tables. Countries, telecommunications providers, financial networks, universities, research institutes, entire regions simply stopped announcing themselves to the rest of the world. Around noon, the first banking outages began. Modern banking isn't local anymore. Transactions travel through layers of verification systems spread across multiple continents. Payment gateways rely on cloud infrastructure. Fraud detection algorithms run on remote data centers. When connectivity between those systems fails, transactions cannot complete. Credit card terminals started timing out. Online banking portals stopped responding. International wire transfers froze mid-processing. The financial sector tried switching to backup routing paths, but backup routes still depend on the same broken internet. By early afternoon, ATMs across several cities began going offline. Banks couldn't verify balances. Retailers couldn't process card payments. Cash withdrawals began failing. People thought it was a bank software outage. The news channels started covering it as a regional banking glitch. But inside the network engineering community, panic was spreading. We were seeing something none of us had ever imagined possible. The internet wasn't under attack. It wasn't just overloaded. It was fragmenting, like tectonic plates drifting apart. Large sections of the global network were becoming isolated islands, still functioning locally, but no longer connected to the rest of the world. And once those islands lost visibility of global routing tables, they couldn't find their way back. By late afternoon, airline reservation systems began failing. Commercial aviation depends heavily on centralized data systems. Flight plans, weather data, passenger manifests, air traffic coordination. All of it moves through interconnected digital networks. Airports started losing communication with airline databases. Ticketing systems froze. Check-in terminals stopped updating. Aircraft already in the air could still communicate through radio and satellite systems, but ground coordination was collapsing. Several major airlines began grounding flights as a precaution. At first, they blamed it on connectivity issues, a vague phrase that hid the terrifying truth. Connectivity itself was dying. Meanwhile, engineers across the world attempted emergency coordination. Normally, we communicate through email, Slack channels, internal dashboards, cloud monitoring tools. All of that was failing too, so we fell back to old systems. IRC servers still running on small independent networks. Legacy email servers on academic networks that hadn't yet disconnected. Private VPN tunnels between engineers who still had partial connectivity. It felt like trying to coordinate a planetary disaster through broken walkie-talkies. Then the submarine cable failures began. When traffic overloads fiber systems, the equipment that amplifies signals along the cable begins overheating. Under normal conditions, those amplifiers operate within safe power margins. But as congestion intensified, signal power levels spiked. Several transatlantic cable operators reported emergency shutdowns to prevent permanent damage. Shutting down those cables removed even more international links, which forced traffic to reroute again, which overloaded the remaining cables even faster. The system was collapsing in layers, like a skyscraper losing its support beams one by one. Around 6 p.m., my supervisor walked into the operations room and said something I will never forget. "Stop trying to fix it." We all stared at him. He pointed at the routing monitor wall. Nearly half of the global internet was gone from the tables. The remaining half was flickering in and out like a dying star. "This isn't an outage," he said quietly. "This is the internet breaking apart." No one argued, because deep down we already knew. By nightfall, most of the major websites people depended on every day were unreachable. Search engines, streaming platforms, online stores, social networks, news websites, they simply stopped loading. Millions of people across the world were staring at blank browser windows, refreshing, restarting routers, resetting phones, calling internet providers. No one had answers, because the truth was almost impossible to explain. The internet had never been designed for a failure like this. It was built to survive localized damage, natural disasters, cable cuts, regional outages, but not simultaneous fragmentation across every continent. Not a cascading collapse of the global routing system itself. By midnight, our network exchange point was barely processing any traffic. Local networks could still reach each other, but international routes were disappearing faster than they could stabilize. The engineers on our team began saving routing table snapshots, historical records of the internet as it died, one by one, network by network, country by country. Around 2 a.m., the final stable routes connecting us to Europe vanished. A few minutes later, the last Asian networks disappeared from the table. South American routes flickered briefly, then dropped out completely. For a moment, our screens showed only North American networks, an isolated continent. Even that didn't last. Regional providers began disconnecting as their upstream routes vanished. By sunrise, our exchange point was operating as a small regional network island, connected to maybe a few hundred nearby networks, a microscopic fragment of what had existed the day before. That morning, I drove home through empty streets. No one yet understood what had happened. Phones still had signal. Electricity still worked. Television broadcasts were still running. To most people, it looked like a weird internet outage, something that would be fixed by lunchtime. But I had seen the routing tables. I had watched the world's digital nervous system tear itself apart in real time. And as I sat in my car outside my apartment, staring at a phone that could no longer reach anything beyond my city, I realized something terrifying. If the routing system didn't stabilize soon, there might never be a global internet again. The second day began with confusion. People woke up expecting the internet to come back. That's how outages work in the modern world. Something breaks, engineers fix it, systems restart, and life continues as if nothing happened. The public has learned to treat digital failures like bad weather, temporary, inconvenient, but never permanent. But by the morning of the second day, engineers across the world were beginning to realize something far worse had happened. The routing tables never stabilized overnight. Normally, when networks disappear from the internet, neighboring networks eventually re-advertise routes and connectivity restores itself. The system is built to heal. This time, the missing network stayed gone. More disturbing than that, new ones were disappearing. When I returned to the exchange facility that morning, the operations room looked different. Less like a workplace, more like a war room. Whiteboards covered in handwritten network maps. Engineers sleeping in chairs. People using personal laptops because many of our cloud-based monitoring tools were unreachable. We were trying to rebuild a map of the remaining internet manually. The fragments that were left. The biggest problem was visibility. Without a functioning global internet, no one could see the entire system anymore. Each region could only see the networks still reachable from their local infrastructure. It was like trying to map the planet while trapped inside a cave. We established voice bridges with a few other exchange points that still had partial connectivity. Chicago, Dallas, Seattle, a handful of Canadian networks. Some academic institutions still had independent fiber routes that were functioning locally. But international connectivity was nearly gone. Europe had fragmented into isolated regional clusters. Asia was mostly unreachable. Africa had almost completely vanished from the routing tables. Satellite internet providers tried stepping in to route around the damage. But satellites rely on ground infrastructure to connect into terrestrial fiber networks. And those terrestrial networks were exactly what had broken. Traffic that normally moved through hundreds of coordinated global pathways was now being forced through a few surviving routes. Those routes were suffocating under the pressure. By midday, another major failure began spreading through the system. DNS collapse. The domain name system is the directory that converts website names into IP addresses. Without DNS, even if a server is still alive somewhere, people can't find it. DNS relies on a distributed hierarchy of root servers and authoritative servers spread across the world. When the internet fractured, many of those servers became unreachable from each other. The system started returning incomplete answers, then wrong answers, then nothing at all. People trying to reach websites that technically still existed were being sent to dead IP addresses. Even engineers who knew the direct addresses of certain systems couldn't reliably connect to them. The internet was becoming a maze with no map. Meanwhile, outside the engineering community, the world was beginning to panic. Businesses opened expecting card payments to work. They didn't. Point-of-sale terminals timed out. Digital wallets failed authentication. Contactless payments stopped processing. At first, stores tried rebooting their systems. Then they tried calling payment processors. But those processors depended on global financial networks that were already disconnected. Within hours, thousands of businesses reverted to the only payment method still functioning: cash. Long lines formed at banks. Except the banks were running into another problem. ATMs had mostly stopped working. Modern ATMs rely on constant connectivity to verify account balances and transaction approvals. Without that verification, the machines simply refused withdrawals. Inside bank branches, employees attempted to process withdrawals manually. But even the internal banking software was built on distributed databases that relied on network connectivity. Many branches couldn't access central account records. Tellers were staring at blank screens. By afternoon, several major banks temporarily closed their branches. Not because they were out of money, but because they could no longer verify who owned it. Meanwhile, the aviation industry began grounding aircraft worldwide. Commercial aviation depends on synchronized digital communication networks. Flight routing, weather systems, maintenance logs, passenger records, navigation databases. When those systems began failing, airline safety protocols triggered automatically. Aircraft already airborne were guided to the nearest airports using traditional radio navigation. Flights scheduled for later that day were canceled. Airport terminals filled with stranded travelers staring at departure boards frozen on yesterday's information. In some airports, the screens simply went dark. Air traffic controllers reverted to procedures that hadn't been widely used in decades. Paper flight strips, voice radio coordination, manual spacing of aircraft. The skies didn't become unsafe, but they became slow, very slow. Cargo aviation suffered the same shutdown, which meant something else the world hadn't yet realized. Supply chains were beginning to break. Modern logistics is almost entirely digital. Shipping containers tracked through global databases. Warehouse automation systems guided by cloud platforms. Inventory systems synchronized between continents. Without those systems, goods stopped moving. Cargo ships at sea still sailed toward their destinations. But many ports had lost access to scheduling systems that coordinated unloading operations. Truck fleets lost GPS routing platforms. Warehouse management systems stopped communicating with retail supply networks. It took about 48 hours before grocery stores began noticing the effects. Deliveries stopped arriving. Most supermarkets only carry a few days of stock. When deliveries stopped, shelves started emptying. Not everywhere at once, but gradually. Certain items disappeared first. Packaged foods, bottled water, baby formula. People were beginning to sense that the outage was something larger. News organizations tried covering the situation, but they were struggling with the same connectivity failures. Journalists couldn't access international news feeds. Wire services couldn't distribute stories globally. Many television stations reverted to local reporting only. Some stations began broadcasting technical experts explaining what might be happening. Most of those experts didn't yet understand the scale of the collapse. They described it as a major internet infrastructure failure, an outage that might take days to repair. Inside the engineering community, we knew better, because we were watching something that looked less like an outage and more like a structural failure of the system itself. Late that afternoon, we attempted something desperate. Engineers from several exchange points began manually rebuilding routing coordination, essentially trying to create a smaller internet. A regional one. We shared lists of functioning networks, manually approved routing announcements, filtered unstable routes. For a few hours it worked. Traffic between several states stabilized. Certain regional websites came back online. Some email systems started delivering messages again. It felt like we might actually be stabilizing a small part of the system. Then the next failure wave arrived. Data centers began shutting down. Most large data centers are designed with redundant power systems and cooling infrastructure, but they rely on remote monitoring networks, automated traffic balancing, cloud management systems. When connectivity collapses, those automated systems begin malfunctioning. Some data centers were suddenly receiving far more traffic than they were designed to handle. Other centers received almost none. Load balancing systems that normally distribute traffic across dozens of facilities stopped functioning. Certain servers began overheating under abnormal loads. Cooling systems designed to respond to automated monitoring signals failed to activate properly. Technicians on-site tried managing systems manually, but many facilities were not staffed for full manual operation. Within hours, reports began coming in of major data center clusters powering down equipment to prevent catastrophic damage. When those centers went offline, the services hosted inside them disappeared completely. Entire platforms vanished from what little internet remained. Streaming platforms, cloud storage systems, enterprise software, business databases, educational platforms. Some of those systems contained data that millions of people relied on daily. Medical records, legal documents, financial transaction logs, educational records. Much of that data still physically existed inside powered-down servers. But with the networks broken, no one could reach it. By the evening of the second day, electricity grids in several regions began experiencing instability. This surprised many people. After all, power grids existed long before the internet. But modern power systems depend heavily on digital communication networks for monitoring and coordination. Load balancing between regions, automated fault detection, remote control of substations. When those networks failed, operators lost visibility across large sections of the grid. Power plants began operating in isolation from each other. That's dangerous. Electric grids are like giant balancing acts. Supply and demand must remain synchronized across thousands of miles. Without communication systems coordinating that balance, fluctuations began spreading through the network. Several regions experienced temporary blackouts as safety systems shut down parts of the grid to prevent larger failures. Nothing permanent yet, but the warning signs were there. The third day would bring something the world had not experienced in generations. The realization that the systems holding modern civilization together were not separate at all. They were all connected, and when the internet collapsed, everything connected to it began unraveling. By the third day, the silence began spreading. Not the silence of quiet streets or empty buildings. The silence of systems that had stopped talking to each other. The modern world runs on machines constantly exchanging information. Servers verifying transactions, routers negotiating paths, control systems reporting sensor readings every second. When those conversations stop, the machines don't simply wait politely. They start failing. That morning, the operations center where I worked was running on emergency procedures we had never truly expected to use. Most of our monitoring dashboards were gone because the cloud platforms hosting them had disappeared with the rest of the internet. Instead, we were staring at raw router consoles, scrolling command outputs, and paper notebooks where engineers were manually writing down network changes. It felt like stepping backwards 25 years overnight. What remained of our regional network was fragile but alive. A few hundred autonomous systems were still exchanging routes locally. Universities, hospitals, a few telecommunications companies, several government networks. Together they formed a small digital island in what used to be the global internet. But even that island was unstable. Every hour more networks vanished. Not because of routing failures anymore, because their infrastructure was physically shutting down. Most internet infrastructure assumes constant remote management. When connections fail, technicians lose the ability to adjust configurations, balance loads, or coordinate repairs with upstream providers. Small providers began disconnecting entirely just to protect their equipment. Meanwhile, outside the network engineering world, people were starting to understand something was deeply wrong. The financial sector reached its breaking point first. Without connectivity between banks, payment clearinghouses, and central financial authorities, the global payment system froze. Credit card companies could not reconcile transactions. Digital banking systems could not verify balances between institutions. Retailers across the country began refusing electronic payments entirely. Signs appeared in store windows, cash only, but cash itself quickly became a problem. Banks were still holding billions of dollars in physical currency, but distributing it required coordination between branches, vaults, and armored transport services. Those services relied on digital scheduling systems. Within hours of the cash rush beginning, many banks simply ran out of physical bills. Crowds formed outside bank branches demanding withdrawals. Some branches tried issuing handwritten withdrawal slips that customers could redeem later. Others closed their doors entirely. I remember walking into a small grocery store near my apartment that afternoon. The shelves already looked different. Not empty yet, but thinner. Customers were buying in unusual quantities. Canned goods, rice, bottled water, anything that would last without refrigeration. The store manager had placed a cardboard sign on the checkout counter. No card payments. Cash only. Limit 2 items per customer. Behind the counter, the cashier was using a mechanical calculator to total purchases. No barcode scanners. No digital registers. Just a small metal machine printing numbers on a paper roll. For the first time, it felt like the modern retail system had stepped into another century. By the 4th day, hospitals began facing their own crisis. Modern medical systems depend heavily on centralized digital records. Patient histories, medication databases, diagnostic imaging archives, insurance verification systems, all of it exists inside network data platforms. When those platforms vanished, hospitals suddenly lost access to decades of medical history. Doctors could still treat injuries. They could still perform surgeries. But they no longer had immediate access to the information that guided many medical decisions. Allergies, medication interactions, chronic conditions, imaging records stored in remote archives. Many hospitals reverted to paper charting within hours. Nurses began writing patient information by hand again. Pharmacists cross-checked medications using printed reference books instead of digital databases. It worked, but it was slow. And hospitals were already under pressure from another problem. Supply chains. Pharmaceutical distribution relies on extremely coordinated logistics networks. Medications move through refrigerated warehouses, regional distributors, hospital supply chains. Those systems rely on continuous digital communication. Within 5 days, several hospitals began reporting shortages of certain medications. Insulin shipments delayed. Antibiotics stuck in warehouses. Specialized surgical supplies missing from scheduled deliveries. None of the infrastructure had physically disappeared. The trucks still existed. The warehouses still existed. But the coordination systems that told everything where to go had collapsed. Meanwhile, the power grid instability I mentioned earlier began spreading more seriously. Electric grid operators normally monitor thousands of sensors across transmission lines and substations. That data flows through network systems, allowing operators to balance loads across large regions. Without reliable communication networks, those sensors stopped reporting consistently. Operators began flying blind. In several states, small grid failures cascaded into regional blackouts. Nothing permanent yet, but the outages were growing longer. The moment electricity disappears, something else follows. Water. Most municipal water systems rely on electrically powered pumps and automated monitoring equipment. When power fails, water pressure drops. Several cities experienced temporary water shortages during extended outages. Local governments began broadcasting emergency instructions over television and radio. Boil water advisories. Conserve electricity. Limit travel. The tone of those broadcasts changed rapidly over the next few days. At first, they sounded confident, technical, temporary. By the end of the first week, the language had shifted. Authorities stopped talking about restoring the internet quickly. Instead, they began focusing on maintaining essential services. Food distribution, medical care, electric grid stability, law enforcement presence in urban areas where shortages were beginning to cause unrest. Around this time, another group quietly stepped into the gap left by the internet. Amateur radio operators. Ham radio networks had existed for decades mostly as hobbyist communities. Enthusiasts building antennas in their garages, bouncing radio signals off the atmosphere, talking with strangers thousands of miles away. For years, people joked that ham radio was an outdated hobby, a relic from before smartphones and social media. But those operators had something the modern internet suddenly didn't: independence. Their communication systems didn't rely on global infrastructure, just radios, antennas, and electricity. Within days, amateur radio operators began forming informal information networks. Local news updates, weather reports, supply availability, emergency requests. Some operators began relaying messages between cities hundreds of miles apart. Others connected medical facilities needing supplies with nearby communities that still had them. The signals were scratchy, slow, but they worked, and slowly governments began noticing. Emergency management agencies started coordinating with radio clubs to distribute information across regions where digital communication had collapsed entirely. By the third week, people stopped calling it an outage. Language changed slowly at first. News anchors began saying things like the ongoing network crisis or the digital infrastructure collapse. Governments issued statements about long-term recovery planning. But out in the streets, people had already chosen a simpler phrase: the blackout. Not because the power was gone everywhere, because the digital world had gone dark. During the early weeks, most of the attention focused on financial systems, food distribution, and transportation. Those failures were immediate and visible. But beneath those obvious disruptions, another transformation was taking place. One that would reshape society in ways most people hadn't yet realized. Information itself was becoming local again. For decades, people had grown accustomed to knowing everything instantly. News from across the planet arriving in seconds. Weather updates from satellites. Real-time traffic data. Global conversations happening across billions of devices. All of that vanished almost overnight. Television still worked in many places, but national networks struggled without centralized digital distribution systems. Satellite broadcasting helped, but even satellite uplinks depended on ground infrastructure that was increasingly unstable. Many stations reverted to local broadcasts only. Local news, local weather, local announcements. Radio filled much of the gap. Shortwave stations that had been nearly silent for years suddenly became critical again. Emergency broadcasters, amateur operators, regional government transmitters, voices began reappearing across frequencies that had once carried only static. Information traveled slower now, sometimes dramatically slower. A major event in another country might take days to reach us through radio relays or cargo ship crews passing along reports at port. For the first time in generations, the world felt larger again. Not because the planet had changed, because the network that made it feel small had disappeared. Inside the engineering community, we continued analyzing the fragments of the old internet, trying to understand exactly why it had failed so completely. The collapse wasn't caused by a single event. There was no giant explosion, no global cyberweapon, no mysterious pulse from the sun. Instead, it appeared to be something far more unsettling. A chain reaction of vulnerabilities. Years before the collapse, network infrastructure had become increasingly centralized. Massive cloud providers handled enormous percentages of global data traffic. Content delivery networks routed huge portions of the web through a small number of highly optimized backbone routes. Efficiency had replaced redundancy. That efficiency worked beautifully until it didn't. When the routing instability began, those central systems became pressure points. Traffic surged through pathways never designed to carry that much load. Submarine cables overloaded. Routing tables destabilized. Autonomous systems began withdrawing routes to protect themselves. Every defensive reaction made the global network smaller. Every smaller network increased pressure on what remained. Eventually, the system reached a tipping point. A moment when the internet stopped being one interconnected network and became thousands of isolated ones. Once that fragmentation happened, restoring global routing coordination became nearly impossible. Because coordination itself required the network that had just disappeared. By the fourth week, governments began publicly acknowledging something engineers already understood. Rebuilding the internet would take years, maybe decades. Even if the physical cables still existed, the trust relationships between thousands of network operators had collapsed. Routing authorities had lost visibility. Infrastructure providers had powered down major equipment clusters to prevent damage. And perhaps most importantly, many organizations had already begun adapting to a world without global connectivity. Human systems adapt quickly when survival requires it. Regional communication networks expanded. Universities began hosting local knowledge archives. Digital libraries accessible inside each regional network cluster. Cities established public information terminals connected to local servers that carried news updates, medical guidelines, and government announcements. Engineers started experimenting with something we began calling micronets. Small, localized internet systems built around city fiber loops or university infrastructure. These networks used simplified routing protocols and local DNS systems. Inside a micronet, websites worked normally. Messaging platforms operated. Businesses ran digital services again. But the network stopped at the edge of the region. Beyond that boundary, there was nothing. Felt strange at first. Typing a website address and realizing it only existed inside your own city. But people adapted faster than many of us expected. Local businesses launched regional online marketplaces hosted on micronet servers. Schools built education platforms accessible within their local network. Hospitals connected their medical systems to regional databases shared between nearby facilities. It wasn't the global internet, but it was something. A patchwork of digital islands scattered across the planet. Meanwhile, the analog world kept returning in ways I never thought I would see. Libraries expanded again. Printed newspapers reappeared in many cities. Community bulletin boards filled with handwritten notices offering services, supplies, and information. Postal services experienced an unexpected revival. Without instant messaging or global email, physical letters became meaningful again. Weeks after the collapse, I received my first handwritten letter from an engineer friend in another state. It had taken 9 days to arrive by truck relay. Inside, he had drawn a diagram of the regional network they were building. Hand-drawn network architecture. something I hadn't seen since my early career. Air travel slowly returned in limited form. Without the massive global coordination systems airlines once relied on, flights became more localized. Regional routes connecting nearby cities operated using simplified scheduling systems and manual coordination. International flights were rare, but cargo ships continued moving between continents, carrying goods and occasionally carrying information. Printed documents, storage drives, physical data transfers between regions trying to reconnect fragments of the old digital world. Meanwhile, the power grid gradually stabilized. Engineers modified control systems to operate with limited connectivity. Many substations were upgraded with manual control capabilities again. Operators reintroduced procedures that had existed decades earlier before automation dominated the grid. The electrical system became less efficient, but more resilient. It was one of many lessons learned during those first months. Efficiency had built the modern world. Resilience would rebuild it. By the third month, something else had changed. The panic faded. The first weeks had been chaotic, shortages, confusion, economic shock. But humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. Local economies reorganized. Cash circulation stabilized. Barter systems appeared in smaller communities where currency shortages persisted. Farmers began selling directly to local markets rather than through complex global distribution chains. Urban areas struggled longer than rural ones, but even cities eventually adapted as new supply routes formed. And through all of it, the voices on the radio kept talking. Emergency broadcasts, community updates, technical discussions between engineers rebuilding regional networks, stories from people rediscovering a slower world. The airwaves became a strange mixture of survival and reflection. One evening, about 4 months after the collapse, I walked outside the station where I now broadcast these reports. The sky looked different than it used to. For years, satellite constellations had filled the night with faint moving lights. Thousands of small dots crossing the darkness as internet satellites relayed signals across the globe. Many of those satellites were still up there, but without ground infrastructure coordinating them, most had drifted into useless orbits. The sky was darker again, quieter. Standing there, I realized something I had been too busy to notice before. The world hadn't ended. Civilization hadn't collapsed into chaos. It had simply changed direction. Faster had become slower. Global had become regional. Digital had rediscovered analog. And the strange thing was, life continued. 6 months after the blackout, the world no longer felt like it was recovering from a disaster. It felt like it had entered a different era. The early weeks had been dominated by fear and confusion. People waited for announcements saying the internet would be restored. Governments promised investigations. Technology companies released statements about rebuilding infrastructure. But as months passed, those promises quietly shifted into something else. Planning for a different future. I still spend most nights inside the small broadcasting room of this old weather station. The equipment around me predates the internet itself. Vacuum tube amplifiers, analog meters, switches that click when you flip them. Strange how technology designed decades ago became reliable again, simply because it never depended on anything larger than itself. The shortwave frequencies are crowded now. Not with entertainment programs like the old days, but with practical communication. Agricultural reports, regional trade announcements, weather forecasts relayed between coastal stations, engineering discussions about rebuilding communication systems. Some nights I hear voices from thousands of miles away bouncing through the upper atmosphere. The planet talking again, just in a slower language. Out in the cities, the transformation is even more visible. The regional micronets that engineers began building during the early weeks have grown into something stable. Most major cities now operate their own local networks connected through fiber loops, microwave relays, and in some places even repurposed television broadcast frequencies carrying digital packets. Inside those networks, the digital world still exists. People can access local websites. Businesses run digital accounting systems again. Schools host online learning platforms for students inside the region. Local messaging apps have appeared, allowing people to communicate within the city or surrounding counties. But the boundaries are strict. Try to reach beyond them and you hit the edge of the network. A quiet digital wall where global connectivity used to exist. At first, people hated those limits. Years of living inside a limitless internet made the new boundaries feel unnatural. But over time, something unexpected happened. Local digital cultures began forming. Every region built its own platforms, its own online communities, its own information systems tailored to local needs. A city's micronet became less like a fragment of the old internet and more like a digital town square. The engineers designing these networks are careful now. We avoid the kind of global dependencies that once made the system fragile. Routing protocols are simpler. Infrastructure is decentralized. Redundant communication paths exist even between small communities. Some networks rely partly on radio relays instead of fiber cables. Slower, yes, but far more resilient. Meanwhile, global communication has not completely disappeared. It just travels differently. Large cargo ships crossing oceans now carry physical data archives between continents. Massive storage drives filled with scientific research, medical data, engineering documentation. When those ships arrive at port, the drives are connected to regional networks and synchronized. It's not instant communication, but knowledge still moves across the world. Scientists sometimes joke that information now travels at the speed of a cargo ship again, about 15 knots. Air travel has gradually expanded as well. Not the massive global aviation network that once existed, but regional systems connecting major cities within continents. Pilots now rely more heavily on onboard navigation and traditional radio coordination. Air traffic controllers still use digital tools inside regional networks, but the system is no longer dependent on global connectivity. Flights are fewer, more deliberate, but they work. Trade routes are reorganizing too. Without instant global logistics systems, supply chains have become shorter and more regional. Manufacturing, once scattered across multiple continents, is slowly shifting closer to the places where goods are used. Factories reopening in regions that had once outsourced everything overseas. It's inefficient by the standards of the old world. But stability has become more valuable than efficiency. Even the financial system has evolved. Banks rebuilt their internal networks inside regional infrastructures. Digital banking still exists within those boundaries, but international transfers are rare and slow. Cash regained importance during the early months, and in many places it still dominates everyday transactions. In smaller towns, barter markets remain common. Farm produce traded for mechanical repairs. Tools exchanged for medical supplies. A kind of informal economy that once existed everywhere but had nearly vanished in the digital age. Watching all of this unfold has been strange for someone who spent most of his career building the very systems that collapsed. For years, we believed the internet represented progress in its purest form. Unlimited information, instant communication, connected world. And in many ways, it did bring those things. But it also quietly concentrated the world's infrastructure into a fragile web of dependencies. When that web tore apart, we discovered how much of our civilization had been resting on it. Now something different is emerging. Not a single global network, but thousands of smaller ones. Independent, adaptable, capable of surviving local failures without collapsing the entire system. Some engineers are already working on experimental long-distance communication protocols designed specifically for this new fragmented world. Protocols that expect delays. Protocols that tolerate broken connections. Protocols that pass data slowly across networks that might only connect once every few hours through scheduled radio links or physical data transfers. The goal isn't to rebuild the old internet. The goal is to build something that can survive. A network of networks again, but one designed with the lessons of collapse burned into its architecture. Tonight, while adjusting the transmitter before starting this broadcast, I looked through a small notebook where I've been recording events since the blackout began. The first entry describes the morning when the routing tables started collapsing. Back then, I wrote something in the margin. Civilization might not survive this. At the time, it felt like a realistic possibility. Modern systems had become so intertwined that losing one threatened all the others. But 6 months later, I can see something I couldn't see then. Civilization didn't collapse. It adapted. Messily. Slowly. But steadily. Human beings have lived without the internet for nearly all of our history. The difference now is that we remember what it was like. We carry the knowledge of the digital age even while rebuilding a world that no longer has it in the same form. The younger engineers working on these new regional networks are designing systems with a humility that didn't exist before. No one talks about building a permanent, unstoppable infrastructure anymore. Every design includes failure as an assumption. Every network expects pieces of itself to go dark occasionally. And every system is built so that when something fails, the rest of the world keeps working. Sometimes late at night, when the radio bands quiet down, I think about the old internet. About the moment when billions of people could speak to each other instantly across continents. When knowledge moved at the speed of light. That era is over. But strangely enough, the world that followed feels a little more grounded. More aware of its limits. More careful with the systems it builds. And maybe a little more human. A year has passed since the morning the internet disappeared. When I say that out loud on the air, it still feels unreal. For 3 decades, the internet was treated like a permanent feature of civilization. Something as stable as highways or electricity. Losing it seemed as impossible as losing the oceans. But time has a way of normalizing even the most extraordinary changes. Today, entire cities operate inside regional digital networks that didn't exist 12 months ago. Children are growing up in a world where the internet means something local, something you connect to inside your city, not something that reaches across the planet. When they hear older people talk about watching videos uploaded from the other side of the world in seconds, it sounds almost mythical, like stories about the first days of aviation, back when humanity briefly believed the sky had no limits. I've spent the past year helping maintain the regional network cluster that formed around several cities in this part of the country. It began as a fragile experiment built from surviving fiber lines and repurposed routing equipment. Now it supports hospitals, schools, local businesses, and government communication across nearly 2 million people. Not bad for something that started with engineers scribbling network diagrams on whiteboards during a crisis. The infrastructure is very different from what we used to build. Instead of massive centralized data centers, most services run on smaller distributed servers located throughout the region. If one facility goes down, the others continue operating. Routing protocols are intentionally simple. Traffic is predictable. Nothing depends on distant infrastructure. Even our DNS system is local. Instead of a global hierarchy of servers, every region maintains its own directory of domain names. Many cities have adopted naming conventions tied to geography rather than corporate brands. You'll see addresses like market.denver.local, library.frontrange.local, clinic.coloradomed.local. They feel almost quaint compared to the sprawling domain names of the old internet. But they work. More importantly, they belong to the communities that use them. A few months ago, engineers from several regions attempted the first experimental interconnection between 2 large micronets. Not a full restoration of global connectivity, just a controlled exchange point between neighboring regions. The connection was slow, only a few megabits per second carried through a microwave relay chain across mountain terrain. But when the link stabilized, something remarkable happened. 2 isolated digital worlds suddenly touched. Messages passed between them. Data synchronized. For a moment, we saw the possibility of something new forming. Not the old global internet. Something more like a federation of regional networks. Carefully connected. Loosely coordinated. Designed so that if one region fails, the others remain unaffected. The project is still experimental. Links appear and disappear depending on weather conditions, power stability, and available equipment. But the idea has spread. Engineers in other countries are attempting similar connections. A slow, cautious process of stitching parts of the world back together, without recreating the fragile structure that once collapsed. Meanwhile, everyday life continues adapting. In many ways, people seem calmer than they were before the blackout. There's less noise, less constant information flooding into people's lives from every corner of the planet. News travels slower now, but it also feels more relevant. Local weather, local politics, local community events. The scope of daily attention has narrowed, and strangely, people seem less overwhelmed. Libraries are crowded again. Printed books circulate constantly. Teachers say students focus better without the endless distractions that once existed online. Small local newspapers have returned in many cities. Some print daily editions. Others publish weekly summaries of regional events. The printing presses run late into the night now, something that hadn't happened in decades. Mail carriers have become important again too. Not just delivering packages, but letters. Actual handwritten letters. I still receive a few every month. Engineers sharing designs for new networking equipment. Radio operators sending reception reports from distant regions. Sometimes just ordinary people describing what life looks like in their part of the world. One letter arrived from a coastal town several hundred miles away. The writer described how their community rebuilt its fishing industry after losing access to global export markets. Instead of shipping seafood overseas, they now supply nearby inland cities through regional trade routes. The entire economy reorganized itself around geography again, something that hadn't been necessary for generations. Even the night sky tells a story about the change. Many of the satellite constellations that once carried internet traffic have now been decommissioned or left drifting. Without ground networks managing them, maintaining those systems became impractical. When I step outside the station after midnight broadcasts, the stars are brighter than I remember from my childhood. The faint moving lights that once crossed the sky every few minutes are mostly gone. It's a quiet reminder of the world we lost, but also of the one we gained. Every now and then someone asks me on the radio whether the old internet will ever return. Whether one day we'll reconnect the planet the way it once was. Technically, it's possible. The cables still lie across the ocean floors. Many satellites still orbit above us. The hardware could be rebuilt. But after watching the past year unfold, I'm not sure anyone truly wants the old system back. Not exactly the way it was. Because now we understand something we didn't before. The strength of civilization doesn't come from making everything connected. It comes from making sure everything can survive when connections fail. The world learned that lesson the hard way, and the systems being built now reflect it. Small networks, independent communities, communication paths that can disappear and reappear without collapsing the whole structure. The slower, less spectacular, but it's stable. Tonight, as I sit here speaking into this microphone, I can hear faint radio signals from other broadcasters across the continent. Weather stations, emergency networks, independent operators relaying local information. Hundreds of voices filling the airwaves. The planet still talking to itself. Just not all at once anymore. And perhaps that's the final truth we've discovered after losing the internet. The world was never truly silent. It was simply waiting for us to learn how to listen again. About 18 months after the blackout, something unusual happened on the airwaves. Not a crisis, not an emergency broadcast, just a message. It came through a relay chain of amateur radio operators moving east to west across the continent. Each operator repeating the signal, strengthening it, pushing it further across the patchwork of radio networks that had grown since the collapse. By the time the message reached our region, it had passed through nearly 40 different transmitters. The message was simple. Engineers on the eastern seaboard had successfully linked 3 major regional micronets together through a stable long-distance relay. Not a temporary test, a functioning connection. Slow, heavily regulated, and carefully monitored, but real. For the first time since the blackout, multiple large population centers were exchanging digital data again. The link worked using a hybrid system. Part microwave relay towers, part atmospheric radio bounce. part physical data synchronization. It wasn't constant connectivity like the old internet. Instead, the connection opened for scheduled windows several times a day. During those windows, the networks exchanged compressed data packages, messages, research archives, public records, system updates. When the window closed, each region continued operating independently until the next exchange. The design was deliberate. Engineers wanted to make sure no single connection could destabilize the network again. Every region remained capable of surviving on its own. But slowly, carefully, pieces of the world were beginning to reconnect. The announcement spread across radio frequencies within hours. Across the country, engineers began discussing the implications. Could this become the foundation for a new interregional network? A slower but safer digital bridge between parts of the world? No one rushed to celebrate. We had all learned how dangerous optimism could be when dealing with complex systems. Still, the possibility felt important, because for nearly 2 years humanity had been living in isolated pockets of connectivity. Regional networks thriving locally but separated from each other by vast communication gaps. This new system hinted that those gaps might someday narrow. Meanwhile, daily life continued evolving. One of the most interesting changes has been how communities rediscovered physical gathering places. Before the blackout, social life for millions of people revolved around digital platforms. Conversations happening on screens, communities forming in online spaces that existed nowhere in the physical world. When those platforms vanished, people had to find each other again. Town halls reopened. Community markets expanded. Public lectures and local events became popular again. Even local theaters and music halls began filling up more frequently. People still use regional digital networks to communicate, of course, but those networks feel more like tools than entire worlds. Conversations often start online and finish face-to-face. Something about losing instant global communication reminded people that the humans around them matter most. The education system changed dramatically as well. Schools had depended heavily on global information networks for research, coursework, and communication. When those disappeared, educators had to rethink how knowledge was distributed. Local knowledge archives became extremely important. Universities began curating massive regional libraries, collections of scientific papers, textbooks, engineering documentation, medical research. Many of these archives were transferred between regions through physical storage shipments during the early months after the blackout. Now those libraries form the backbone of education inside each micronet. Students still access digital information, but it's curated, finite, organized deliberately rather than pulled instantly from an infinite global web. Some teachers say it improved learning. Students explore knowledge more deeply when they aren't drowning in endless search results. Of course, not everything about the new world is easier. International cooperation remains slow. Scientific collaboration across continents is difficult when data must travel physically or through limited relay connections. Global economic systems remain fragmented. Travel between continents is still rare, and there are regions of the world where recovery has been much harder. Some countries lacked the infrastructure to build stable regional networks quickly. Others faced political instability once global communication collapsed. Information from those places reaches us slowly, often through travelers or cargo crews who carry stories between ports. The world is still uneven, but even there, signs of adaptation appear. Communities rebuilding communication systems from whatever technology they can gather. Radio networks linking villages. Local computing centers hosting small information databases. Human ingenuity filling the gaps where global systems once stood. Back here at the station, the routine of broadcasting has become almost peaceful. The equipment hums quietly. The transmitter warms the room with the faint scent of hot electronics. Outside the windows, the surrounding hills are dark except for scattered lights from nearby towns. Sometimes, while speaking into the microphone, I imagine the signal leaving the antenna tower, climbing into the night sky, skipping across the upper atmosphere, landing in distant receivers hundreds or even thousands of miles away. People listening quietly in homes, vehicles, remote outposts. Voices traveling across the same invisible paths humanity used long before fiber optics and satellites dominated communication. There's something reassuring about it. A reminder that technology doesn't have to be complicated to connect people. It just has to work. And that may be the greatest lesson the blackout left behind. For decades, the world chased speed. Faster communication, faster transactions, faster delivery of information. Everything optimized for maximum efficiency. But efficiency-built systems so tightly interconnected that when they failed, everything failed together. Now we build systems differently, with gaps, with buffers, with the expectation that pieces will break occasionally, and that the rest of the system must continue functioning anyway. The new world isn't faster, but it's stronger, and slowly, almost quietly, the planet is beginning to reconnect again, one careful link at a time. 2 years after the blackout, the world finally stopped measuring time by the collapse. For a long while, everything was described in relation to it. The first week after the blackout, 3 months after the blackout, the first winter after the blackout. But eventually the language changed. People began saying things like last spring or last harvest season again. The disaster had become history instead of the center of every conversation. That shift didn't mean the world had returned to what it once was. Far from it. But it meant humanity had settled into its new rhythm. The regional networks that began as emergency systems had matured into something remarkably stable. Cities and surrounding rural areas now operate within digital regions that function almost like independent ecosystems. Each region maintains its own infrastructure, local data centers, local domain registries, local communication platforms, local knowledge archives. Inside those networks, life feels surprisingly modern. Businesses run digital services again. Hospitals manage patient databases. Schools distribute coursework electronically. But step outside the boundary of the region and the signal fades. That boundary has become one of the defining features of the new world. The edge of the network. Engineers sometimes call it the horizon, because beyond it lies uncertainty. Beyond it lies the rest of the planet, still slowly reconnecting. The experimental long-distance connections I mentioned earlier have expanded cautiously during the past year. Several major regions across the continent now exchange scheduled data packages through microwave relays and atmospheric radio links. These exchanges happen only a few times each day. When the connection window opens, the regional servers begin transmitting compressed bundles of information. Scientific updates, weather data, medical research, engineering documentation, public communications, sometimes even recorded cultural material, music performances, films, books digitized by libraries. When the exchange window closes, each region returns to operating independently. It's a strange system compared to the old internet. Back then, information flowed constantly. Now it moves in tides, rising and falling several times a day. But it works. More importantly, it works without risking the collapse that destroyed the old network. International connections are beginning to appear too. A research consortium recently established a stable relay chain linking several regions in North America with partners across the Atlantic. The data rate is slow, only a few gigabytes transferred each day. But those gigabytes carry enormous importance. Climate research, medical discoveries, engineering breakthroughs, the kind of knowledge humanity benefits from sharing globally. Watching those systems develop reminds me of something historians once wrote about the earliest telegraph networks. In the 19th century, information began traveling across continents for the first time through copper wires and relay stations. Messages passed slowly between cities, but the world suddenly felt more connected than ever before. What we're building now feels similar. Not a return to the old internet. Something closer to a new beginning. A cautious first step toward reconnecting the planet again. Meanwhile, life on the ground continues evolving. Agriculture has changed in interesting ways. Without global logistics networks dictating supply chains, many regions began growing more of their own food. Local farming cooperatives expanded rapidly during the first year after the blackout. Urban agriculture became surprisingly common. Vacant lots transformed into community gardens. Rooftops converted into small-scale farms. Some cities even built greenhouse districts along and used industrial zones. The goal wasn't total self-sufficiency, but resilience. A lesson learned from the early weeks when grocery shelves emptied faster than anyone expected. Manufacturing followed a similar path. Industries that once relied on complex international supply chains began reorganizing production closer to home. Factories reopened in places that had lost manufacturing decades earlier. The process hasn't been smooth. Some technologies remain difficult to produce regionally, but engineers are finding creative solutions. Modular designs that rely on components available locally. The globalized economy hasn't vanished, but it has slowed down and spread out. Less concentrated, less fragile. Culturally, the changes have been even more fascinating. Without the constant stream of global media once delivered by the internet, regional cultures have begun developing more distinctly again. Local musicians perform for local audiences. Regional writers publish through local presses. Community radio stations broadcast stories, interviews, and performances that once might have been lost in the noise of the global web. Feels more personal, more connected to place. Of course, people still exchange cultural material between regions through the scheduled data links. Music, films, books. But those exchanges feel more intentional now. Not an endless flood of content. More like letters between distant communities. One thing that surprises many people is how much quieter the world feels psychologically. Before the blackout, millions of people lived inside a constant storm of information. Notifications, news alerts, messages arriving every second. Now communication happens at a slower pace. People check their regional networks a few times a day rather than every few minutes. Most conversations happen face-to-face. Many psychologists believe the change has had unexpected benefits. Anxiety levels in several regions have actually decreased. People feel more present in their physical communities. More grounded. Of course, nostalgia for the old internet still exists, especially among those who grew up inside it. Sometimes during broadcasts, I receive letters from listeners describing what they miss most. Video calls with distant relatives. Instant access to global knowledge. The ability to explore cultures across the planet from a single screen. Those things mattered, and some of them may return in new forms as interregional networks expand. But I've noticed something interesting when those conversations happen. Even the people who miss the old internet rarely say they want everything back exactly the way it was. Because now we understand the cost of that system. The hidden fragility beneath its convenience. And so the new networks continue growing slowly, carefully. Every connection tested repeatedly before it becomes permanent. Every protocol designed to tolerate failure. The engineers building this infrastructure often repeat the same phrase. Nothing should be able to break the whole world again. Tonight, as I sit here finishing this broadcast, I can hear faint digital tones coming through a nearby receiver. That sound means one of the regional data exchange windows has opened. Somewhere beyond the mountains, another network is sending information toward us. Bundles of data traveling across microwave relays and atmospheric radio links. Crossing hundreds of miles before arriving here. It's not the speed of light web we once had, but it is communication. And communication, even when slow, has always been the thread that holds civilization together. 3 years have passed since the blackout, long enough that some people barely remember the exact day it happened. Not because it wasn't important, but because the world that followed became normal. Entire neighborhoods have been built during these 3 years. Businesses have opened, children have started school. New technologies have been invented. Life continued moving forward even while the foundations of the old digital world remained buried in the past. When historians eventually write about this period, they will probably divide modern history into 2 eras. Before the network collapse, and after, The phrase global internet already sounds outdated when you hear younger engineers talk about communication systems today. For them, the concept feels almost unrealistic, like describing a machine that connected every computer on Earth continuously without interruption. Now networks are designed to exist independently. Every region assumes it might lose external connections at any moment. The systems I help maintain here have become part of a larger regional federation that stretches across several states. Over the past year, engineers managed to establish 4 stable long-distance exchange links between major population centers. Each link operates on a scheduled cycle. Every 6 hours, the systems synchronize data. Regional news reports, scientific updates, medical bulletins, public records, even personal messages queued for delivery across regions. It's fascinating watching how those messages move. A letter sent from our network might travel through 3 regional exchanges before reaching its destination hundreds of miles away. Each exchange stores the data temporarily until the next transmission window opens. Sometimes the journey takes a few hours, sometimes a full day. People have learned to be patient again. And strangely enough, patience seems to have improved communication. Messages are longer, more thoughtful. People write with intention rather than firing off dozens of fragmented replies. I suppose when a message takes hours to arrive, you take the time to say what actually matters. International data exchanges have improved as well. The transatlantic research relay I mentioned earlier now transfers information twice a day instead of once. Other relay chains are forming between parts of Asia, Europe, and South America. Slowly, the planet is beginning to resemble a mosaic of interconnected regions. Not a single web, more like a constellation, separate points of light linked by careful lines. The system works precisely because those lines are limited. They carry essential information, not endless noise. Meanwhile, the analog communication networks that helped humanity survive the early months of the blackout are still active. Amateur radio communities remain incredibly strong. Many regions now maintain permanent radio relay stations, staffed by volunteers and technicians who coordinate long-distance voice communication. In emergencies, those radio networks still become the fastest way to spread information. It's comforting knowing that even if every digital system failed tomorrow, human voices could still travel across the planet through the atmosphere. Some nights I listen to operators bouncing signals across the ionosphere from thousands of miles away, their voices fading in and out with the rhythm of the upper atmosphere. The technology feels ancient, but it still works, and that reliability means everything now. Daily life has settled into patterns that would have felt strange before the blackout. People rely heavily on their regional networks for practical needs: banking, education, local news, medical services. But global curiosity hasn't disappeared. Travel between continents is slowly increasing again. Ships carry not just goods but travelers eager to see how other parts of the world rebuilt themselves. Those travelers often return with stories about regional innovations. New agricultural methods developed in isolated climates. New communication equipment built from repurposed hardware. New cultural traditions forming in communities that spent years cut off from the rest of the planet. The blackout didn't stop creativity. If anything, it accelerated it. When systems break, people invent new ones. The night sky has also changed again during these past years. A new generation of satellites is beginning to appear overhead. Not the massive constellations that once carried internet traffic. These are different. Fewer satellites, more autonomous, designed to support the new regional network model. Instead of routing massive amounts of global traffic, they act as temporary bridges between distant regions when conditions allow. The connections they create are brief, sometimes only a few minutes as a satellite passes overhead. But during those minutes, enormous amounts of compressed data can transfer between ground stations. Engineers call the system store and forward orbital relays. A satellite receives data from one region, stores it temporarily, then transmits it to another region when it passes overhead. The process repeats continuously as satellites orbit the Earth. It's slow compared to the old internet, but it's resilient. If one satellite fails, the rest continue functioning. Watching those faint lights crossing the sky again reminds me how determined humanity can be when rebuilding something important. Not rebuilding the past. Building something better suited for the future. Sometimes I think about that first morning when the routing tables began collapsing. Back then, the situation felt hopeless. The internet had been so enormous, so deeply embedded into every system of civilization, that losing it felt like losing the nervous system of the modern world. And in many ways, we did lose that nervous system. But what replaced it turned out to be something closer to how living organisms actually survive. Distributed, adaptable, capable of continuing even when parts of the system fail. Civilization didn't rebuild a single brain. It grew thousands of smaller ones, each region thinking for itself, each network maintaining its own balance. And yet, slowly, those independent systems are learning how to speak to each other again. Not constantly, not instantly, but reliably, which may be more valuable in the long run. When I finish broadcasts like this one, I often step outside for a few minutes before shutting down the transmitter. Tonight the air is cool and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train moves slowly along the valley floor. Above me, the sky is clear. Stars scattered across the darkness, and moving between them, a few faint satellites gliding silently across the horizon. 3 years ago, the world lost the network that once connected everything. But standing here now, watching those lights crossing the sky and hearing distant voices traveling through the radio bands, it's clear that humanity never lost the most important part of communication, the need to reach each other. 3 years ago, the world believed it had built the ultimate communication system, a network that moved faster than thought, linking billions of people across oceans and continents in an invisible web of light and data. When that web collapsed, it felt like the end of something permanent. But now, standing here years later, watching the slow rebirth of communication across radio towers, regional networks, cargo ships, and quiet satellites drifting overhead, I understand something we couldn't see during those first terrifying days. The old internet connected the world instantly. The new one connects it carefully. And perhaps that difference is the reason this one will last.